In the earliest hours of the morning, before the sun had fully crested the horizon to burn away the mist clinging to the hedgerows, the mail began its journey. It was a routine so deeply embedded in the machinery of the conflict that it had become invisible, a heartbeat within the larger body of the war. Sacks of canvas, heavy and stained with the grease of the transport trains, were unloaded from the docks and thrown onto the backs of waiting trucks. Inside those sacks, amidst the parcels of socks and cigarettes and tins of chocolate, lay the envelopes. They were thin, flimsy things, usually made of the cheapest paper available, often folded over and sealed with a lick of spit that had long since dried. They were blue or white or sometimes a grimy beige, bearing addresses scrawled in hurried pencil or fading ink, the handwriting looping across the surface in intimate, familiar patterns that stood in stark contrast to the industrial efficiency of the postmark stamped over them. These envelopes moved through a vast, labyrinthine network that spanned oceans and continents, a logistical miracle that functioned with a terrifying precision. They traveled in the dark holds of ships that cut through hostile waters, vulnerable to the silent menace of submarines lurking below the waves. They were transferred to trains that shuddered along rusted tracks, passing through landscapes that had been pulverized into unrecognizable wastelands of mud and shattered timber. Then they were loaded onto smaller trucks, and finally, into the packs of infantrymen or the saddlebags of couriers who rode out toward the shifting, volatile front lines. The system was designed to connect the home front to the battlefront, to thread a line of communication across the chasm of separation, allowing a slice of normalcy to penetrate the absurdity of the trenches. It was a physical manifestation of hope, a tangible weight in a pocket that reminded a man holding a rifle that he was still a son, a husband, a father, and not merely a statistic in a ledger of casualties, but the very efficiency that made this system possible also contained a cruel, inherent capacity for tragedy. The machinery of the military post did not stop for death, nor did it possess the ability to know the fate of the man who had held the pen. As the shells whistled down to tear apart the earth and the screams of the dying echoed through the night, the mail continued to move forward. It crossed paths with the battalions marching toward the slaughter, passed through checkpoints where soldiers checked watches and scanned the sky for aircraft, and arrived at the sorting stations established just behind the lines. There, under canvas tents lit by flickering lanterns, clerks with ink-stained fingers sorted the piles into stacks, reading out names and company numbers, separating the living from the dead without knowing which was which. An envelope addressed to a specific private in a specific platoon was bundled with the rest, tied with twine, and handed off to a runner who would carry it forward, stepping over the bodies of the recently fallen to deliver words that were already ghosts. The journey was a physical testimony to a time that had already ceased to exist. By the time an envelope was slit open by a mother's trembling hands or a wife's hopeful eyes, the hands that had written the words were cold. The paper had traveled further than the man who wrote it, surviving the mud and the blood and the roar of artillery to arrive at a doorstep on a quiet street thousands of miles away. It traveled alone, disconnected from its source, carrying a voice that had been silenced days or weeks prior. There was no malice in the delivery, only the blind, relentless march of bureaucracy that could not distinguish between a man who was breathing and a man who was buried. The envelope arrived pristine, or perhaps crumpled and creased, but always final, a vessel of memory that had outlived its creator. It sat on the mantelpiece or the kitchen table, a silent intruder in a house of mourning, bearing a cheerful drawing or a request for a pair of boots, completely unaware that the world it described had gone dark. The lag between the moment a soldier dipped his nib into the inkwell and the moment his mother lifted the letter from her doormat was a gulf that swallowed reality whole. In the countryside of France or the dense jungles of the Pacific, the act of writing was an attempt to freeze time, to capture a fleeting sensation of safety or a mundane complaint about the food and trap it within the four corners of a piece of paper. But the paper had to travel, and travel meant duration. It meant days stacked upon days, a slow accumulation of hours during which the universe of the writer could violently collapse. The infrastructure designed to bridge that distance was robust, yet it operated on a linear, human scale that could not hope to compete with the instantaneous, industrial slaughter of modern warfare. While the words were in transit, protected within the belly of a mailbag or the cargo hold of a Liberty ship, the artillery barrages did not pause to wait for their delivery. The war continued to chew through men and material at a voracious pace, rendering the news contained within those envelopes ancient history before it ever reached the eyes of the intended recipient. This temporal dislocation created a surreal form of emotional arithmetic. A soldier might write a letter on a Tuesday evening, describing a lull in the fighting and the beauty of a sunset scene over the ruins of a bombed-out church. He might express confidence, a lightheartedness born of a momentary reprieve, telling his sweetheart not to worry and that he would be home before Christmas. That letter would be collected, stamped, and sent on a winding journey that took weeks. On a Wednesday morning, merely hours after the ink had dried, the whistle of a mortar shell would cut that confidence short, ending the soldier's life and changing the mathematical trajectory of his family's future forever. Yet, the letter continued its voyage, carrying the Tuesday version of the man into a Friday reality where he no longer existed. It carried the lie of his survival across the ocean, protected by the unyielding neutrality of the postal service, which delivered the past into the present without warning or apology. The phenomenon was not merely a delay, it was a haunting suspension of the laws of physics. In the towns and cities of the home front, life moved forward under a cloud of dread, governed by the ominous approach of the telegram boy, whose bicycle tires crunched on the gravel driveways with the sound of a final sentence. Families watched the calendar pages turn, counting the days since the last correspondence, finding a fragile relief in the arrival of a letter postmarked a week prior. They clung to the date on the stamp as a talisman, proof that their boy was alive when he wrote it, ignoring the terrifying void that had opened up since. The arrival of the mail became a daily ritual of Russian roulette, where the sight of a familiar handwriting could induce a rush of endorphins even as the heart braced for the blow. It was a cruel inversion of expectation, where the physical evidence of life was often the precursor to the official notification of death, arriving not as a comfort, but as a painful echo of a voice that had already been stilled. As the weeks dragged on, the gap between the living writer and the dead recipient widened, creating a timeline that was fundamentally broken. A letter written in high spirits during a moment of victory might be read during a period of retreat and deepening despair, its cheerful tone jarring against the somber mood of the household. Or worse, a letter written days before a massive offensive, full of nervous energy and pre-battle jitters, might arrive long after the casualty lists had been published in the local paper, transforming a private expression of fear into a public artifact of tragedy. The disconnect allowed the dead to speak for weeks after they had fallen, their voices emanating from the page with a vibrancy that mocked the silence of the grave. The delay ensured that grief was not a single event but a prolonged torture, a series of arrivals that forced the bereaved to relive the loss over and over again, each letter acting as a small resurrection that ended with the realization that the person they were reading was gone, dissolved into the mud and the memory of a battlefield that was already fading into history. The landscape on which these letters were conceived was a broken, churning expanse of desolation that defied the very concept of habitation, a place where the natural geometry of the earth had been blasted into a nightmare of craters and tangled wire. It was a theater of violence where the noise was constant and overwhelming, a physical weight that pressed against the eardrums and vibrated in the hollows of the chest. The roar of artillery barrages rolled across the terrain like thunder that never broke, punctuated by the sharper, staccato cracks of rifle fire and the high-pitched whistling of incoming shells that signaled imminent death. In this environment, human senses were assaulted to the point of shutdown, the mind retreating into a primal state focused solely on survival. Yet, amidst the cacophony of destruction, there existed pockets of relative stillness, moments in the dugouts and trenches where men huddled together, attempting to create a semblance of privacy in a world that had stripped them of all dignity. The battlefields were devoid of the traditional witnesses of civilian life, no neighbors, no passers-by, no authorities to document the mundane details of existence. The only witnesses were other soldiers, men equally trapped in the quagmire, their eyes glazed by the exhaustion of watching the horizon for the slightest movement. In this isolation, the act of writing became a desperate attempt to insert a human presence into a vacuum of inhumanity. Soldiers perched on ammunition boxes or leaned against the damp, revet walls of dugouts, using their knees as desks while the ground beneath them shook from the concussion of nearby explosions. The light was often failing, the dim gray of twilight filtering through the smoke, forcing them to squint at the paper as they tried to form words that made sense amidst the insanity. They were writing into a void, sending their thoughts out into a darkness that seemed impenetrable, hoping that the words would survive the journey home even if they did not. The sensory experience of the front line was a thick, suffocating blanket of mud, blood, and the distinct, metallic tang of high explosives that lingered on the tongue. It was a place where time lost its meaning, where days blurred into a continuous cycle of watchfulness and sleep deprivation, broken only by the terror of an attack. The physical discomfort was absolute, uniforms were stiff with grime, skin was raw with trench foot, and the cold was a bone-deep ache that never truly faded. In these conditions, the decision to write a letter was an act of defiance against the environment. It required a discipline of mind to block out the screams of the wounded coming from the no-man's land beyond the wire and the flares that floated silently overhead, illuminating the slaughter below. The writer had to mentally transport himself thousands of miles away to a quiet front porch or a warm kitchen, inhabiting a memory so vividly that the ink flowing from his pen did not shake with the fear that gripped his heart. But the battlefield was also a place of profound loneliness, a crowded isolation where men were surrounded by comrades yet felt entirely cut off from the world they knew. The letters were written not just to communicate with families, but to anchor the writer to his own identity. Without the connection to the home front, the soldier risked becoming nothing more than a component of the war machine, a replaceable cog in the grinding gears of the offensive. The paper served as a proxy for the world that was still continuing, unaware and untouched by the horrors of the front. As the shells exploded nearby, showering the earth with dirt and debris, the soldier wrote about the weather or a parcel received, clinging to the trivialities of life as a shield against the overwhelming chaos. The battlefield demanded everything of them, their strength, their sanity, and eventually their lives, but it could not take the words they sent away, those invisible threads that connected the mud of the trenches to the safety of the living room floor. The cessation of writing usually came abruptly, dictated not by the completion of a thought but by the harsh reality of the operational clock. In the trenches or the muddy encampments, the act of composition was a stolen privilege, constantly under threat from the demands of the command structure. A whistle might blow from the officer's dugout, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the damp air and signaled the end of rest. In that instant, the pen was capped or the pencil tucked into a breast pocket, the letter folded perhaps too quickly, creasing the paper in awkward angles. There was rarely time for a final revision or a second reading to check for errors. The narrative was left in whatever state it occupied when the call to arms came. The paper was shoved into an envelope, the seal pressed down with a thumb, and the missive was handed over to the runner or dropped into the field post bag. The connection was severed, the physical link between the man and his words snapped as he turned to pick up his rifle and adjust his helmet, stepping out of the private sphere of memory and back into the collective anonymity of the unit. For those who did not survive the engagement that followed, the end of writing marked the final boundary of their existence. The sentence that trailed off or the paragraph that ended mid-thought became the permanent terminus of their voice. There was no opportunity to add a postscript, no chance to scribble a hasty, "I love you," in the margin as the shell came in. The narrative simply stopped, frozen in time, preserving the soldier's state of mind at that exact second, whether it was anxious, hopeful, or resigned. The physical letter became a static object in a world that continued to move, an artifact of a life that had been intersected by catastrophe. The man who wrote it ceased to be a complex, evolving human being and instantly became a memory, his entire future condensed into the few square inches of paper that were now making their way to the rear. The transition from writing subject to historical casualty was instantaneous and absolute, leaving the letter suspended in the journey back home like a message in a bottle thrown from a sinking ship. On the battlefield itself, the silence that followed a violent barrage often swallowed the individual identities of the fallen. The chaos of the attack gave way to the eerie stillness of the aftermath, where the only sounds were the groans of the wounded and the shouts of the stretcher-bearers. In this landscape, the personal effects of the dead were scattered, but the letters had already gone, carried away by the logistics of the mail system that operated indifferent to death. The ground where the soldier fell would be churned by artillery and trampled by reinforcements, obliterating the physical trace of his presence. Yet, the words he had written just hours or days before continued to exist in a state of preservation, traveling through the supply lines that fed the war machine. The disconnect was profound. The body was broken and returning to the earth, while the handwritten testament to his soul was traveling in the opposite direction, clean and dry, toward the safety of the civilian world. This temporal schism created a unique form of tragedy for those who would eventually receive the mail. The moment of writing was the last time the soldier was truly himself, constructing a reality for his loved ones that he knew might be a fabrication but felt necessary to maintain. He was performing a role, the role of the survivor, the protector, the son who would return. When the writing ended, the performance ended, and the raw biological reality of war took over. The letter became a mask that the soldier wore across the ocean, a smiling face drawn in ink that hid the gaping wound of mortality. The family would read it later, trying to discern the truth in the looping cursive, unaware that the moment the pen lifted from the paper, the person they knew had effectively already left them, stranded in the mud while his words traveled on alone. The act of writing in the field was often performed in a desperate clutch against the elements, a struggle to maintain dignity amidst the encroaching chaos of the front. Soldiers huddled in the corners of dugouts or sat on ammunition crates, using these as writing desks while the ground beneath them shuddered from the concussion of distant or nearby artillery. The light was poor, usually the dim glow of a hurricane lamp or the fading gray of twilight, forcing the writer to squint as he guided his nib across the coarse, fiber-heavy paper that the military provided. This was not stationery chosen for its quality. It was functional, durable enough to survive the grime of a pack, but it resisted the ink, often catching and splattering if the hand shook or the cold was too severe. The letters were composed in fits and starts, sentences broken off by the sudden need to grab a helmet or run for a bunker, leaving gaps in the narrative that were never filled, silences that spoke louder than the descriptions of rations or the weather. There was a specific, haunting quality to the ink chosen for these final correspondences. It was often India ink or a standard issue blue-black, indelible and meant to last, a stark contrast to the ephemeral nature of the lives it was recording. When a soldier wrote, "I am fine," or "We are moving out tomorrow," he was pressing a permanent mark onto the page, not knowing that he was simultaneously writing his own eulogy. The handwriting itself tells a story of psychological strain. In the early letters, the script is steady, loops are rounded, and the slant is consistent, reflecting a mind that is still anchored to the discipline of civilian life. But as the weeks wore on and the bombardments continued, the letters would change. The penmanship would become jagged, the letters cramped and small as if the writer were trying to hide his words from the enemy, or large and erratic, scrawled with a feverish intensity that suggested a mind racing to capture every last thought before the inevitable occurred. The ink would bleed slightly into the paper if the humidity was high, creating fuzzy edges on the words that looked like the boundaries of a memory dissolving. The content of these letters was dictated by a strict, unspoken code of conduct that permeated the ranks. Men were acutely aware that their words would be the last thing their loved ones would hold on to, and this burden shaped every sentence. They avoided the graphic horrors of the trenches, the smell of decomposition, and the sight of dismembered friends. Instead, they focused on the mundane, the small details that proved they were still human. They wrote about the taste of a particularly good stew, the beauty of a wildflower growing in the cratered earth, or a joke shared with a comrade in the latrine. These descriptions were not merely filler, they were lifelines thrown across the ocean, an attempt to sanitize the nightmare for the consumption of parents and wives who could never understand the reality of the meat grinder. By writing about the normal, they were trying to convince themselves that they were still part of the world of the living, that the uniform they wore had not completely consumed the man beneath it. However, despite the censorship and the self-imposed silence, the fear often seeped through the cracks in the prose. It appeared in the repetition of certain phrases, the way a soldier would write, "Do not worry," 3 times in a single paragraph, or the sudden shift to philosophical musings about the nature of fate in the very last paragraph. There was a palpable urgency in the sign-offs. Where once they might have written, "Your loving son," they began to write, "With all my love, now and always," or "Yours till the end." The ink dried, carrying the subconscious weight of a farewell that the writer was not yet ready to speak aloud. They folded the paper with trembling hands, sealed the envelope, and trusted it to the sack, believing in the lie that the paper was stronger than the steel that awaited them. In those moments, hunched over a scrap of paper in a muddy hole, the writing was not just a message, it was an act of defying death, an assertion of existence that the post office would eventually transform into an artifact of mourning. The hands that gripped the pencils and pens in the trenches were often indistinguishable from the earth they fought in, stained with the ingrained grease of weapons, the residue of explosives, and the omnipresent mud that clung to skin like a second layer. These were the hands of laborers and clerks, of farm boys and bankers, now unified by the raw physicality of war, calloused and nicked, the knuckles swollen and split. As they moved across the paper, these hands performed a strange, delicate dance that was entirely at odds with the violence they had recently perpetrated or witnessed. There was a trembling in the fingers, a subtle vibration that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with the adrenaline coursing through the veins. The act of holding a writing instrument required a level of fine motor control that was brutally at odds with the trigger squeeze reflex drilled into them by basic training, forcing a temporary reconciliation between the instinct to kill and the necessity to connect. In many cases, these hands were operating on borrowed time, writing with a frantic urgency that suggested a subconscious awareness of the approaching void. Soldiers rode in snatched moments between barrages, glancing over their shoulders at the sky or listening for the whistle of incoming shells, their eyes darting between the page and the horizon. The grip on the pen was often white-knuckled, an anchor in a world spinning out of control. They wrote not for the present moment, where the smell of cordite hung heavy in the air and the screams of the wounded pierced the night, but for a future they desperately wanted to believe in but deep down feared they would never see. They were constructing a narrative of survival for their families, building a facade of normalcy with every sentence, trying to write a version of themselves that would survive long after their physical bodies had been broken apart. The paper became a time capsule, and the hand moving across it was the mechanism attempting to preserve a soul that was about to be extinguished. There was a profound tragedy in the optimism of these hands. As they formed the words, "See you soon," or "Looking forward to leave," they were physically manifesting a promise that the universe was already preparing to break. The soldiers often wrote about plans that were nothing more than fantasies, describing walks they would take and daughters they would walk down the aisle. The hand guided the pen to ink these dreams into reality, making them tangible on the page, lending them a weight and permanence that the brutal calculus of war would render obsolete in an instant. The disconnect was palpable. A hand that had just pulled the pin on a grenade, that had just dug a grave for a friend, was now gently tracing a curve of love at the bottom of a letter. It was a desperate act of creation in the face of relentless destruction, a refusal to let the war define the entirety of their existence, even as the artillery zeroes in on their coordinates. When the end came, it was often sudden, leaving the hand frozen in mid-motion or the pen dropped into the dirt, the letter unfinished, the sentence dangling like a severed limb. But more often, the letters were finished, sealed, and handed over, the hands having done their job. Those same hands would later be seen by others, perhaps lifeless and clutching the rifle stock, or blown entirely away, leaving behind only the marks they had made on paper as proof that they had ever possessed the agency to love or hope. The irony was that the hands which committed the ultimate violence of the battlefield were also the instruments of the tenderness that survived them. The letters traveled home, and when the families opened them, they often traced the handwriting, running their fingers over the indentations in the paper made by the pressure of a dead man's hand, trying to feel the warmth that had once radiated from the skin, seeking a final, tactile connection in the ink trails left behind by a ghost. The logistics of evacuation from the combat zone were executed with a ruthless, mechanical precision that stood in stark contrast to the fragile humanity contained within the parcels. At the collection points, located in canvas tents or the ruined shells of brick buildings just behind the lines, the mail was gathered, sorted, and sacked. It was a chaotic symphony of shouting clerks, cursing drivers, and the rumble of trucks that never slept. The sacks were heavy, not just with weight but with the emotional density of thousands of trapped voices. They were thrown onto the beds of transports alongside crates of ammunition and rations, treated as cargo that was vital to the war effort, for it was understood that morale was a weapon as necessary as artillery. As the trucks ground their gears and lurched away from the front, kicking up plumes of dust and smoke, they carried the only things that would eventually leave the battlefield alive, the words of the men who were statistically likely to die there. The journey backward was a traverse through the layers of the war machine, moving from the raw, immediate danger of the trenches to the sprawling, organized infrastructure of the rear. The trucks bumped along cratered roads, passing columns of marching men who looked with hollow eyes at the vehicles heading away, knowing the mail contained the only connection they had to the world they were fighting for. The letters passed through depots where they were fumigated, sorted by regiment, and then by company, a process that stripped away the individuality of the sender, reducing him to a series of numbers and a zip code. Yet, the handwriting on the envelopes remained stubbornly unique, a personal protest against the industrial sorting process. The ink survived the shaking, the jostling, and the stifling heat of the transport holds, preserving the sentiment of the writer even as the physical distance between him and his words grew with every mile. As the mail moved toward the ports, the transition from the theater of war to the civilian world began to take shape. The sounds of the guns faded, replaced by the mundane noises of supply trains and the bustle of dockworkers. The sacks were unloaded onto ships that were themselves part of a vast convoy, steel giants bristling with guns riding low in the water. The letters were tucked deep in the holds, stacked in tiers that rose from the bottom of the ship, surrounded by the machinery of global conflict. They crossed the oceans in darkness, moving silently beneath the stars, unaware of the submarines hunting the convoys or the mines drifting invisible in the currents. The survival of the letters was entirely contingent on the survival of the ship, a gamble played out on the high seas where a single torpedo could send thousands of messages to the bottom, drowning the voices of an entire battalion in the freezing black water. The dispatch process was a one-way valve. Everything that went forward to the lines, men, steel, food, was consumed, but the only thing that came back was this paper. The vast majority of the men who wrote the letters would remain behind, grounded in the mud, their futures shrinking to the perimeter of a foxhole. The mail became a kind of spiritual evacuation, a refugee flight of the soul leaving the body behind. The bureaucracy that controlled the flow of information was meticulous, ensuring that even if a man died, his correspondence was given priority, as if the written word had a higher rank than the flesh and blood that created it. The letters moved faster than the reinforcements, cutting through the red tape and the danger, racing toward a destination that the writer would never reach. They were the advance guard of grief, traveling with the certainty of gravity toward the doorsteps that would soon be marked by silence. The logistical machinery of war ground to a halt only for the finality of death, yet even then, the gears kept turning in a macabre fashion. On the scarred battlefields of France and Belgium, the earth itself seemed to reject the sheer volume of the fallen, leaving burial details to work with grim efficiency. Soldiers were stripped of their identification discs, their personal effects hastily bagged and tagged, their bodies lowered into shallow graves or long, communal trenches. The dirt thrown over them was not a blanket but a seal, locking them into a foreign soil miles from the rolling hills of Ohio or the flatlands of the prairie. It was a physical permanence that stood in stark contrast to the movement of the living armies. Here, the war stopped for the individual. The uniform that had once animated a life was now just a casing, stiff with dried mud and gore, left to settle into the silence of the Western Front. They became fixtures of the landscape, indistinguishable from the shattered tree stumps and cratered earth, their physical presence fixed in a moment of time that the rest of the world had already moved past. Back in the quiet parlors of America, this reality had not yet arrived. The space left by a son or a husband remained a physical void, a chair that was not occupied, a plate that was not set, but the air in the house still vibrated with the expectation of their return. The families lived in the interim, a state of suspension where the lack of a body allowed for a fragile, dangerous hope. Without the tangible evidence of loss, the mind could construct elaborate alternative histories, scenarios where the report was a mistake, where the hospital records were mixed up, where the missing man was merely suffering from temporary amnesia. The rooms were kept exactly as they had left them, shaving brushes still on the bureau, shoes still by the door, creating a shrine to a presence that was no longer there but hadn't yet been proven gone. It was a haunting domestic limbo, where the silence of the empty house was louder than the distant artillery, and every creak of the floorboards signaled a possibility that would never come to pass. That fragile hope was destined to collide with the brutal bureaucracy of the Quartermaster Corps, which operated with a singular, unyielding directive, to account for every piece of flesh that could be found. The process of repatriation was industrial in its scale, treating the dead as freight to be moved from one depot to another. Bodies were exhumed from temporary graves, placed in pine boxes, and loaded onto rail cars that rattled through the countryside of a continent trying to heal. The transition from the anonymity of a battlefield grave to the sanctity of a family plot was a journey measured in weeks and months, a slow reverse march across the Atlantic. While the souls of the departed had ostensibly left the moment the heart stopped beating, their physical husks were engaged in a slow, lumbering exodus that trailed far behind the rapid flow of information. The trains moved through the night, unseen by the public, carrying their cargo of sorrow toward ports where the ships waited to ferry them home, a final, silent convoy making its way across the black waters of the ocean. When the telegrams finally ceased and the knock on the door came from the quartermaster's representative rather than the Western Union boy, the abstract horror of the battlefield transformed into a concrete, undeniable grief. The receipt of a personal effects box, containing a battered helmet, a fragmented watch, a stained diary, bridged the gap between the romanticized hero and the brutalized corpse. The smell of the trench mud that still clung to these items was a sensory intrusion, a pungent, earthy reminder of where they had died. It was in this moment that the true separation occurred, severing the tie between the living and the dead with a violent finality. The cheerful letters, still pinned to the kitchen wall or tucked into Bibles, now read like messages from a ghost. The handwriting was familiar, the sentiments were bright, but the hand that had held the pen was now dust. The body that had sat in the trench to write those lines was arriving home in a box, a mute testament to the lie that the letters had inadvertently told. The tragedy was no longer a concept discussed in town squares, it was sitting in the front hallway, wrapped in a flag, with the weight of a promise that could never be kept. In the immediate aftermath of a major offensive, the landscape itself often seemed to hold its breath, suspended in a strange and terrible quiet that felt heavier than the bombardment that had preceded it. Across the scarred mud of the Western Front, the air, once thick with the scream of artillery and the chatter of machine gun fire, settled into a damp, ringing stillness. For the soldiers who remained huddled in the trenches or dugouts, this silence was not a relief, it was a harbinger, a vacuum that felt almost physical in its weight. They knew that the absence of noise usually meant the mail carriers could finally move, that the fragile lines of communication might reopen, allowing the vast, bureaucratic machine of the army to resume its function. It was in these lulls, when the smoke began to drift away in long, gray ribbons and the true scope of the devastation became visible, that the wheels of the Postal Service ground back into gear, unaware of the tragic ironies they were about to deliver. Miles behind the lines, in the sprawling, canvas-roofed warehouses that served as the central distribution points for the armies, the quiet was of a different nature. Here, the silence was methodical, broken only by the rhythmic thud of mailbags hitting the wooden sorting tables and the shuffling of clerks moving with efficient haste. These men, covered in the dust of travel and ink, worked tirelessly to sort through the backlog of correspondence that had accumulated during the days of fighting. They handled thousands of envelopes, thin, vellum aerograms, heavier parcels wrapped in brown paper, each one a small, fragile vessel of hope or longing. They read names and battalion numbers with detached professional focus, trying to match the scrawled addresses to the ever-changing roster of units at the front. To them, the letters were merely items of logistics, cargo to be moved forward with the same urgency as ammunition or rations, yet they were the vital link connecting the stagnant horror of the trenches to the world that still felt normal. While the sorting occurred in the rear, the front lines began the grim business of assessing the toll. The quiet here was filled with the sounds of retrieval, the low murmur of stretcher-bearers navigating the broken ground, the occasional sob of a wounded man, and the soft, wet thud of earth being shoveled over temporary graves. The scale of loss was often so vast that the logistical machinery of the army could not keep pace with the reality of death. Reports were written in triplicate, casualty lists compiled with exhausting thoroughness, but the transmission of this information back to the headquarters was slow, prone to delays caused by cut telephone lines or exhausted runners. In this gap between the moment a soldier fell and the moment his death was officially recorded and telegraphed home, a dangerous temporal void opened up. It was a void where the deceased still lived in the eyes of the military bureaucracy, where their name remained on the active duty rolls, and where, crucially, they were still eligible to receive mail. As the trucks began to roll forward from the depots, laden with sacks of mail destined for the decimated regiments, the irony of the situation began to take shape. The drivers navigated the rutted, shell-pocked roads, passing columns of prisoners being marched to the rear and long lines of walking wounded heading the other way. They brought these letters, written days or weeks earlier in the safety of homes, village post offices, or quiet moments behind the lines, right to the edge of the battlefield. The writers had no way of knowing that the recipient had already been obliterated by a shell or cut down by a burst of gunfire. They wrote of local gossip, of the weather back home, of the vegetables growing in the garden, sealing the envelopes with a naive faith that the paper would find its way into living hands. The mail trucks rumbled on, carrying a cargo of cheerful news and mundane affection into a zone that had become a charnel house, unknowingly setting the stage for a second wave of tragedy that would strike families long after the guns had fallen silent. When the mail finally reached the forward units, the distribution process took on a surreal quality. In the mud-filled communication trenches, runners would shout out names, tossing bundles of letters to the men who were still alive to catch them. For those who did not step forward to answer the call, a different routine began. The company clerks, often exhausted men with ink-stained fingers, would set aside the mail for the missing or the fallen, placing it neatly in a specific pile intended for return to sender or held for forwarding. These envelopes sat on crude, makeshift desks, often illuminated by the flickering light of a candle or a storm lantern. They were arranged in orderly stacks, the handwriting on the front appearing heartbreakingly innocent against the backdrop of the ruined dugout. This was the limbo where the letters existed before the final administrative judgment was passed, a purgatory of paper where the dead were still treated as living correspondents, waiting for a message that would never be read. Within the cavernous, dimly lit administrative hub situated miles behind the lines, a vast and silent clerical war was being waged, one fought with ledgers, typewriters, and endless stacks of index cards. The headquarters of the graves registration units and the personnel adjutant offices hummed with the low, rhythmic clacking of keys and the shuffling of paper, a monotonous soundtrack to the bureaucratic processing of loss. Here, the reality of the battlefield was distilled into rows of ink, columns of data that reduced the complex, messy terror of combat into neat, manageable fields. Clerks huddled over wooden desks, their faces illuminated by the green glow of shaded lamps, cross-referencing the morning reports with the master rolls. They were the gatekeepers of information, tasked with the impossible burden of keeping the paperwork current in a war where thousands of men could disappear in a single hour. It was a system built on logic and procedure, yet it was constantly lagging behind the chaotic, blood-soaked immediacy of the front. The machinery of record-keeping was inherently slow, a lumbering beast that required time to digest the carnage. When a casualty occurred, a report had to be written by the unit commander, carried back to the command post, verified, and then physically transported to the administrative center. This process could take days, sometimes weeks, depending on the fluidity of the lines and the integrity of the communication channels. Consequently, the official military records existed in a state of perpetual suspension, a ghostly lag where the dead were still listed as active and the missing were merely absent. The names in the big books were not yet updated, stubbornly clinging to a status that no longer reflected reality. To the bureaucracy, a soldier who had been blown apart by an artillery shell 3 days ago was still technically alive until the paperwork proving his death caught up with him. This administrative inertia created a phantom population, an army of men who walked the pages of the ledgers long after they had stopped breathing. This gap in the records was the architect of the tragedy that was waiting in the mailrooms of the home front. Because the military system had not yet processed the death, the Postal Service was not alerted to stop the delivery of letters addressed to the fallen. The names on the envelopes were still valid in the eyes of the Adjutant General, the addresses were still considered active duty locations. There was no red flag, no black mark next to the serial number to tell the sorting clerk that this specific piece of mail should be pulled aside, that this specific voice should be silenced out of respect for the grieving. The mail continued to be forwarded with the same efficiency as if the man were still sitting in a trench somewhere, simply waiting for a lull in the fighting to write home. The bureaucracy's inability to keep pace with the body count meant that the machinery of hope was allowed to keep operating, unchecked and uncorrected, delivering encouragement to families who were already unknowingly preparing for funerals. The clerks themselves were not immune to the grim irony of their work, though they had to suppress the emotional weight to function. They would see a name come through on a casualty report one morning, noting the date and the manner of death, and then, hours or days later, handle a letter from that same man, dated the day before he died. They would hold the envelope in their hands, feeling the thin paper, knowing that the cheerful scrawl on the front was a message from a corpse. But the protocols were strict. Unless the family had been officially notified via the dreaded telegram, the mail had to go through. The integrity of the system depended on the flow of information, and the clerks were merely cogs in a machine that did not allow for humanitarian intervention based on foreknowledge. So they stamped the letters, forwarded, and sent them on their way, sealing the fates of the recipients with a rubber stamp, consigning the families to one last, cruel conversation with a man who was no longer there. The records remained mute, the ink still wet on the page of the living, while the dead letters traveled on, carriers of a time that had already run out. Within the cavernous, drafty holds of the transport ships crossing the Atlantic, the mail sacks sat piled in precarious pyramids, wedged between crates of ammunition and field rations. To the stevedores loading the vessels, these canvas bags were merely cargo, weighed and measured like any other commodity essential to the war effort. They were stowed deep in the belly of the ship, secured against the violent pitching of the ocean, unaware of the fragile nature of their contents. The bags were coarse and smelled of damp hemp and ink, but inside them lay thousands of folded sheets of paper, each one a thin, compressed slice of time. These were not military orders or logistical manifests, they were the captured thoughts of men who were, at that very moment, staring across no man's land or huddled in waterlogged dugouts. The physical weight of the sacks was deceptive, for while they tipped the scales at hundreds of pounds, their true burden was immeasurable, a mass of memory, hope, and reassurance compressed into a space no larger than a steamer trunk. As the ships cut through the gray waves, the distance between the writers and the recipients widened with every nautical mile, stretching the tether of connection to its breaking point. For the soldiers, the act of depositing a letter into the field post bag was often performed with a tender reverence that belied the squalor of their surroundings. In the moments of relative quiet behind the lines, men would crouch over scraps of paper, using whatever flat surface they could find, a wooden crate, a helmet, a muddy knee, to scrawl their final assurances. They wrote of the weather, of the quality of the food, of the kindness of the locals, carefully curating the reality of the trenches to protect the ones they loved from the true horror of their existence. Once the envelope was sealed and the stamp licked, that letter became a separate entity, a physical vessel carrying the best version of themselves. They entrusted these parcels to the postal couriers, bicycle-riding soldiers who weaving through the traffic of the supply lines, delivering the sacks to the railheads that fed the ports. The writers believed, or perhaps needed to believe, that these words would travel faster than death, that the ink would dry and the paper would be read long before the next artillery barrage found its mark. It was an act of faith in a system that was largely indifferent to individual fate, a gamble that their voice would outlast their body. On the home front, the Postal Service functioned as the circulatory system of the nation's anxiety. The arrival of the mail train was a daily ritual in small towns and bustling cities alike, a moment where the rhythm of life paused in anticipation of word from the front. For the families, the mail sack was not a burlap container but a lottery drum of possibilities. When the postman walked up the path, his bag heavy with the day's delivery, the world narrowed down to the simple question of whether a letter with a military franking mark lay among the bills and advertisements. The physical weight of the mailbag on the postman's shoulder translated directly into the emotional weight on the doorstep. A heavy bag meant news from the boys overseas, a light bag meant silence. The crinkle of paper, the thud of the envelope dropping through the slot, these were the sensory triggers that determined the tenor of the day. The families gathered in the entryways, their hands trembling as they tore open the flaps, desperate to ingest the words that proved their loved ones were still alive, still thinking of them, still present in the world. What the recipients could not see, and what the system did not account for, was the temporal dislocation inherent in every delivery. The logistics of war created a lag that defied the human perception of time. A letter written on a Tuesday morning in a trench under fire might not arrive at a farmhouse in Iowa for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, the writer could have advanced miles across a battlefield, or been cut down in a fleeting second of violence. The envelope in the hand of the mother or the wife was a fossil from a previous era, a snapshot of a life that might already be extinguished. The ink was dry, the handwriting firm, but the hand that held the pen in that specific moment was gone. The postal sack had done its job perfectly. It had protected the letter and transported it across an ocean and a continent with ruthless efficiency. It had delivered the unread life of the soldier to the people who needed it most, unaware that the very existence of the letter was now an act of haunting. The joy of recognition was shadowed by the unseen ghost of the writer, hovering over the paper, a silent passenger who had arrived home without ever leaving the ground where he fell. The logistical arteries that fed the front lines were scarred and tenuous, winding a treacherous path through a landscape that had been churned into an unrecognizable wasteland of craters and shattered tree stumps. For the civilian postal workers and military couriers tasked with moving the mail, these roads represented a daily confrontation with the destructive capacity of modern warfare. They traveled in convoys of battered lorries and wagons, their vehicles laden with the heavy sacks that contained the accumulated thoughts of millions, vibrating over the rough tracks where every pothole threatened to swallow a wheel axle. The routes were dictated not by geography but by the shifting fortunes of the artillery, diverting through ruined villages where the walls of homes were punched out like hollow teeth and the streets were choked with the debris of civilian lives. To drive these roads was to navigate a gallery of horrors, yet the drivers kept their eyes fixed on the ruts ahead, their mission singular and urgent. They were the bearers of connection, moving against the current of men and supplies marching toward death. Delays were not merely inconvenient, they were structural, woven into the very fabric of the supply chain by the sheer volume of material required to sustain a massive army. A letter written in a quiet sitting room in Yorkshire or a farmhouse in Provence did not fly to the trenches. It moved by the sweat of men and the strain of engines, inching forward through a series of bottlenecks. At railheads that were often targeted by long-range guns, trains sat waiting for clearance, their cars packed tight with the canvas mailbags. Here, the mail competed for space with ammunition, food, and medical supplies, often pushed to the bottom of the priority list when a major offensive was underway. A shipment intended for a specific division might sit unclaimed for days in a muddy depot yard because the unit it was addressed to had been moved or obliterated, leaving the letters in a drifting limbo while the casualty lists grew longer at the administration tents nearby. The geography of the destroyed regions added another layer of lethargy to the delivery. Bridges were down, forcing convoys to make lengthy detours through waterlogged fields that threatened to mire the wheels of the heaviest trucks. The rain, turning the ground into a thick, grasping clay, could slow progress to a crawl, forcing drivers to shovel for hours just to free a vehicle from the grip of the road. In these moments of stillness, surrounded by the rusting hulks of tanks and the skeletal remains of gun carriages, the mailbags lay silent in the back, filled with words that were rapidly losing their relevance to the reality at the front. The physical distance between the writer and the front was shrinking in terms of miles, but the temporal distance was widening, creating a disconnect where the news from home grew older with every mile it crawled closer to the guns. Within the chaos of the transport network, there existed a rigorous, almost obsessive system of sorting and routing that aimed to maintain order amidst the anarchy. Mail was organized by regiment, by battalion, and by company, a complex taxonomy that required constant updating as units were reorganized or wiped out. Clerks in advanced sorting stations worked by lamplight in damp requisition buildings, cross-referencing the ever-changing casualty rosters with the names on the envelopes. They performed a heartbreaking triage of paper, pulling out letters addressed to men who had already been buried in marked or unmarked graves. These separated letters were not discarded, they were bundled and labeled with bureaucratic precision, destined for the dead letter office, or prepared to be sent back to the senders with the dreaded notification stamped in red ink. This process took time, precious days that allowed the irony of the situation to mature, letting cheerful assurances of survival travel across the channel even as the telegrams announcing the opposite were being typed up. As the mail finally neared the trenches, the journey shifted from vehicular transport to the backs of men. Runners, often young soldiers chosen for their stamina, slung the canvas bags over their shoulders and scrambled down the communication trenches, dodging the stretcher-bearers carrying the wounded back the other way. The final leg of the journey was the most perilous and the most intimate, as the letters passed through the hands of those living in the shadow of death. The runners navigated the duckboards that kept them out of the freezing mud, stepping over the abandoned equipment of the fallen, delivering the bundles to company commanders who would act as the final distributors. The letters had traveled hundreds of miles, survived shelling, rain, and bureaucratic gridlock, and were now resting within yards of the men they were written for, close enough to be touched, yet forever out of reach for those who had already departed. In the quiet suburbs and the brick terraces of the industrial cities, the mornings retained a fragile rhythm that tried to ignore the war tearing across the ocean. Sunlight still filtered through lace curtains, dust motes dancing in the beams that cut across the polished linoleum of the entryway. The ritual of the morning post was a cornerstone of normalcy, a small, predictable event that structured the beginning of the day. The sound of the mail slot clattering open, followed by the dull thud of envelopes hitting the floor, was a familiar trigger in households where the heart of the family was missing. It was a sound that could cause a sudden intake of breath, a momentary freezing of movement over a bowl of porridge or a cup of tea, followed by a rush of adrenaline that propelled a mother or a wife toward the door. The world outside continued with its mundane concerns, the delivery of milk bottles, the distant hum of traffic, the neighbor's dog barking, but inside, the atmosphere was perpetually suspended in a state of anxious anticipation. The floors of these homes were scrubbed clean, kept tidy as a defense against the encroaching chaos of the news reports that blared from the radio in the corner. When the letters lay on the doormat, they were innocent things, mixed in with bills and advertising flyers, indistinguishable from the routine correspondence of civilian life. There was no aura of doom about them, no scent of gunpowder or trench mud clinging to the paper. They were simply white or blue rectangles, bearing cancelled stamps and postmarks from places that sounded foreign and dangerous, yet looked harmless enough in the dim light of the hallway. A mother would gather them up, her fingers trembling slightly as she shuffled through the stack, discarding the gas bill and the grocery advertisement until her eyes settled on the handwriting she recognized instantly. It was a script she had seen 1,000 times, on homework assignments, on birthday cards, on the note left on the kitchen table the day he left, and seeing it now brought a rush of relief that was almost physical in its intensity. These were ordinary mornings filled with the scent of brewing coffee and the damp chill of the outside air, moments where the brutality of the conflict felt abstract and far away. The women would often sit in their favorite chairs, the ones with the worn upholstery, smoothing the envelope against their laps before carefully slitting it open. The house was silent save for the rustling of the paper, a sharp contrast to the noisy, crowded barracks or the muddy dugouts where the letters had been composed. They prepared themselves to read the words, steeling their minds against the potential for bad news, yet hoping with a desperate, feverish optimism for news of safety, for a description of a decent meal, or a mention of a leave that might be coming soon. The domestic surroundings, the ticking clock on the mantel, the family photographs on the sideboard, the view of the street through the window, framed the reading of the letter, grounding it in a reality that the soldier was currently denied. It was in this setting of preserved domesticity that the tragedy would strike, turning a moment of connection into a scene of devastation. The physical environment of the home, designed for comfort and continuity, became the stage for a reenactment of loss. The act of reading was solitary and intense, a private communion across thousands of miles that usually brought comfort. But on some days, the ordinary light filtering through the window seemed to illuminate the words with a terrible clarity. The familiar handwriting, which usually signaled life, became a ghostly imprint, a trace of a vitality that had already been extinguished. The safety of the home, with its closed doors and insulated walls, could not buffer against the shock that traveled from the paper to the heart. The morning continued, the sun kept rising, and the neighbors went about their business, unaware that in a quiet living room down the street, the temporal world had just collapsed, leaving a woman holding a piece of paper that had traveled further than the man who wrote it ever could. In the quiet rhythm of the home front, the wait became a discipline in itself, a daily routine calibrated to the irregular schedules of the military post. Housewives and mothers learned the distinct sound of the mail carrier's boots on the pavement, a heavy tread that signaled the possibility of connection. For families scattered across the countryside, the arrival of the post was the central event of the day, a moment that suspended all other activity. The silence that hung over a household when the post passed without leaving anything was heavier than the previous day's quiet, an accumulating weight that pressed down on the spirit. They measured time not by the clock but by the interval between letters, counting the days since the last ink-stained envelope had arrived, and calculating how long it took for words to travel from a muddy trench in France to a quiet parlor in Ohio. The lag was a known variable, a necessary friction in the lines of communication that spanned an ocean, but it was a friction that wore nerves raw. They knew the journey was perilous, that ships were torpedoed and trains derailed, so the absence of news was never taken as a sign of safety, only as a void that needed to be filled with faith. The psychological landscape of this waiting was defined by a peculiar kind of double vision. Families lived in two timelines simultaneously, the immediate, mundane reality of rationing, work, and sleep, and the deferred reality of their loved ones' experiences, which were always weeks out of step. A letter received in early October was written in late September, a gap that allowed for a terrifying drift in fortune. When a son described the beauty of the French countryside in the past tense, praising the harvest moon, his parents looked out at their own October leaves and felt a chill, knowing that the landscape he admired might already be a cratered wasteland. Yet they clung to the details. They read the handwriting over and over, analyzing the pressure of the pen, looking for tremors that might indicate fatigue or fear. If the script was steady and the tone light, they allowed themselves a momentary exhale, convincing themselves that the steady hand meant a living man. They constructed a fragile sanctuary out of these delayed assurances, building a belief that if he was happy 2 weeks ago, he must still be happy now. This suspension of disbelief was necessary for survival. To acknowledge the full implications of the time lag was to invite madness. The military encouraged this optimism, strictly censoring news of large-scale defeats to prevent panic on the home front, which meant the waiting population was starved of context. They knew a battle was raging, the newspapers printed names of the dead in columns that grew longer each week, but without a telegram, the abstract horror of war could not touch them. They watched the names of other families in the neighborhood appear in the obituaries, offering casseroles and sympathy to neighbors while privately checking their own mailboxes with a frantic, hidden desperation. The proximity of death made the silence louder. Every knock at the door triggered a visceral physical reaction, a freezing of the blood that only relaxed when the visitor was revealed to be a neighbor or a salesman, not the grim messenger in uniform. And so they waited without knowing, existing in a state of prolonged vertigo. They preserved the normalcy of domestic life, scrubbing floors and weeding gardens, but their attention was always fixed on the horizon, tracking the phantom path of correspondence. The unread letter, the one they believed was on its way, became a totem. It was a promise of a future where the boy came home, where the war ended, where the timeline synced back up and they no longer had to live weeks in the past. They sat by the window as the sun went down, watching the darkness gather, and told themselves that no news was good news, repeating the mantra like a prayer against the encroaching dark. They waited, not realizing that the silence they were hearing was not peace, but the pause before the arrival of a voice that would forever belong to the past. The sun had already climbed high above the rooftops of the quiet Manchester street, casting long, sharp shadows across the cobblestones, but inside the number 42, the air remained stagnant and heavy, trapped behind drawn curtains that had not been fully opened since the autumn began. The house was suffocatingly still, filled only with the rhythmic, dusty ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway and the distant, muffled sounds of the city going about its business, a world that seemed to be continuing entirely without their permission. In the kitchen, a cup of tea sat cold on the table, a dark ring of liquid settling at the bottom, abandoned hours ago when the morning post had failed to bring the news they were praying for. It was a silence that felt physical, a weight pressing down on the furniture and the few occupants who moved through the rooms like ghosts, afraid to disturb the fragile hope that hung in the air. For weeks, the postman had been the arbiter of their fate, his footsteps on the path triggering a rush of adrenaline that was either a wave of relief or a crushing blow, but today, the mail had come and gone with nothing but bills and a circular for a shop they would never visit, leaving the house to settle back into a mournful waiting game that had no clear end. When the knock finally came, it was not the casual, rhythmic rap of a friend or the heavy thud of a delivery man, but a singular, precise sound that seemed to resonate through the floorboards and straight into the marrow of the house. It was a knock that carried its own gravity, distinct and separate from the noises of the ordinary day, and it stopped the clocks ticking in the mind of everyone who heard it. In the hallway, the woman stood frozen, her hand halfway to her mouth, eyes fixed on the dark wood of the front door as if it were a barrier she was not sure she had the strength to open. She knew, with the terrible, instinctive clarity of a mother who has been expecting tragedy for months, that this was not the postman returning with a forgotten letter, and it was not a neighbor borrowing sugar. This was the notification they had been dreading, the formal arrival of the grief they had tried to keep at bay with prayers and silent bargains. The man behind the door shifted his weight, the leather of his uniform creaking faintly, and in that pause before the second knock, the silence of the house stretched tight, threatening to snap under the unbearable tension of the inevitable. She moved slowly, her legs feeling as though they were made of lead, each step a monumental effort that carried her closer to a reality she was not yet ready to face. Her fingers brushed against the cold brass of the doorknob, the metal shocking her skin, and for a fleeting second, she considered turning back, retreating to the safety of the kitchen where the world was still just a possibility and not a confirmed fact. But the duty to know, to see it through to the end, propelled her forward, and she turned the lock with a click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet hallway. The door swung open, revealing the figure standing on the step, a telegraph boy in his uniform cap, holding out a yellow envelope that seemed to glow in the dim light. He did not speak, his face a mask of professional neutrality born of delivering too many such messages, but his eyes held a flicker of sympathy that was worse than any words could have been. The air between them was thick with unspoken horror, and as she reached out to take the envelope, her hand trembling violently, she knew that the life she had known just moments before had ended, and the long, dark winter of mourning had just begun. The ink had dried thousands of miles away, stained into the coarse, cheap paper by a hand that no longer possessed breath, yet the sight of it in the morning light was jarringly, violently alive. For the families left behind, the sheer physical reality of the envelope was often the first blow, the texture of the paper and the distinct, hurried slant of the penmanship tearing a hole in the fabric of their mourning. There was a profound, disorienting shock in recognizing a handwriting that had already been eulogized, a cognitive dissonance that stopped the heart mid-beat. They had memorized the loops and crosses of those letters over years of correspondence from training camps and distant ports, but seeing them now, weeks after a telegram had severed their lives in two, felt less like a message and more like a resurrection. In the quiet of the kitchen or the stillness of the front hallway, holding that piece of mail was an act of touching a ghost, a tactile connection to a person who was simultaneously utterly gone and undeniably present. The hand that had scrawled the address was steady, perhaps a bit shaky from the cold, but it was the same hand that had held a pencil in schoolrooms, the same hand that had held a bride or a child, now frozen in time on a piece of paper that had outrun the news of its author's death. To read the opening lines was to step into a time capsule that had lost its way, plunging the reader back into a moment that should have been safely buried in the past. The voice on the page was cheerful, mundane, and filled with the trivial anxieties of a soldier who did not know he was a ghost yet. He complained about the mud in the trenches, the quality of the stew, or the cigarette shortage, details that served to anchor him firmly in a reality that no longer existed for the reader. It was a cruelty of the highest order that the last words from a loved one were not proclamations of eternal love or final farewells, but rather idle chatter about the weather or a request for more socks. This mundane familiarity was a torture device. The sound of his voice in their heads, reconstructed through the syntax of his sentences, was so vivid that they could almost hear him breathing in the room. They found themselves smiling involuntarily at a joke or a wry observation, a reflex of love, only to have the smile collapse under the crushing weight of remembrance. The letter was a trap, a warm, familiar room that turned into a cell when they realized the door was locked and the occupant had long since vacated the premises. There was a specific pain in the analysis of the handwriting itself, a forensic examination of the script for hidden clues or warnings that hindsight could now invent. The families would trace the letters with a trembling finger, looking for a hesitation in the stroke that might betray a premonition of doom, searching for a dark meaning in a hastily crossed-out word or a smudge of dirt. They knew the pressure he used when he was angry, the slight arch when he was trying to be optimistic, and reading those emotional inflections in a document written posthumously was a form of emotional whiplash. It forced a confrontation with the sheer arbitrariness of time and death. How could a man who wrote with such clarity and focus be reduced to a name on a casualty list mere days later? The paper bore the creases of having been carried in a pocket, perhaps stained by the grease of a rifle or the dampness of a dugout, physical evidence of a journey that had taken too long. Every blot and imperfection was a testament to the human being who had existed in that space, a testament that now served to deepen the wound rather than heal it. As the letter continued, the irony often became unbearable, the cheerful predictions of the future striking the reader like physical blows. He wrote about coming home on leave, about the plans for the garden, or what he intended to do when the war was over, painting a picture of a future that had been violently cancelled. These were not lies, they were the honest hopes of a man who believed he had a future to write about. The tragedy lay in the delivery of these hopes into a world where they could never be fulfilled, delivered by a postal service that functioned with mechanical indifference to human grief. To read, "See you soon," or "I'll write again in a few days," was to stand on the edge of an abyss, knowing that the "soon" was forever and the "few days" were an eternity. The handwriting looped and swirled with the energy of life, mocking the stillness of the grave. It was a document out of time, a slice of life served cold on the platter of death, leaving the survivors to grapple with the impossible geography of a love that had nowhere to land. The familiar hand had reached out across the ocean, not to say goodbye, but to chat, and that casual intimacy was the sharpest knife of all. The moment a letter was finally retrieved from the box, it ceased to be a paper rectangle and became a physical extension of the person miles away. Families handled these envelopes with a reverence reserved for religious relics, smoothing out the creases that had formed during the long transit across the Atlantic. The paper often smelled of foreign tobacco, cheap soap, or the distinct, acrid scent of disinfectant that clung to military field hospitals. For a brief window, the anxiety of the weight was suspended, replaced by the tactile reality of connection. Fingers fumbled with the sealing wax or the tucked-in flaps, desperate to get to the words inside. In the quiet of the kitchen or the parlor, the silence was broken only by the crinkle of paper and the occasional sharp intake of breath as the fold was broken open. The anticipation was not for tragedy, but for the continuation of life, for the proof that the writer's voice was still echoing in the world. What often poured out from those lined pages was a jarring, vibrant optimism that seemed to defy the very nature of the surroundings. The writers, understanding the heavy burden their families carried, curated their words with exquisite care. They wrote of the weather in the French countryside, describing the poppies and the wheat in a way that evoked a pastoral painting rather than a battlefield. They joked about the quality of the stew or the clumsiness of the cooks, transforming the miserable reality of rations into comedic anecdotes meant to draw laughter from a sister or a mother. There was a deliberate effort to sanitize the immediate environment, to edit out the mud, the rats, and the constant thunder of artillery. In these letters, the war was often a backdrop inconvenience, a boring job that kept them away from home, rather than a machinery of death that hunted them daily. This cheerfulness served as a necessary tonic, a code of silence that protected both the writer and the recipient. To speak of the truth would have been to bring the horror directly into the living room, to let the blood and the fear stain the domestic peace. So, they wrote about plans for the future. They detailed the crops they wanted to plant, the car they intended to buy, and the girl they planned to marry back in the county seat. They sketched out a timeline of return that started the moment the armistice was signed, a fantasy of normalcy that required absolute suspension of disbelief. The handwriting remained steady and strong, loops and crosses marching across the page with military precision, offering visual proof of a steady hand and a sound mind. Readers traced these lines, finding comfort in the familiarity of the scrawl, convincing themselves that a man who could write with such humor and hope could not be in mortal peril. As the eyes scanned the paragraphs, the emotional logic of the letter took over. The cheerful words acted as a shield, deflecting the creeping dread that had settled over the household. Families read the jokes aloud, sharing a moment of warmth that felt like a physical embrace. They pinned the letters to the walls or tucked them into Bibles, treating the optimism as gospel. It was a collusion of hope, a shared agreement to believe in the version of reality presented on the page. In that moment of reading, the son was not a soldier in a trench, he was just a boy away at work, tired but in good spirits, looking forward to a hot meal and a soft bed. The tragedy was not absent, but it was held at bay by the sheer force of the writer's will to comfort. The letter, filled with life and light, became a defense against the dark, a temporary fortress built from ink and paper. The telegram lay open on the small mahogany table, its yellow edges curling slightly in the damp air, the official black typewritten font staring up like an accusation from the grave. It had been read a dozen times, the words memorized until they lost their meaning and became nothing more than a collection of harsh sounds: regret, killed, action, deepest sympathy, but the physical object remained the focal point of the room, drawing all eyes and stealing all breath. The ticking of the clock, once a comforting background rhythm to a quiet household, had transformed into a maddening countdown of the seconds that were moving forward while their lives had been abruptly arrested in the past. The mother sat in the high-backed armchair, her hands gripping the fabric until her knuckles turned white, her gaze fixed on a spot on the wallpaper as if waiting for the pattern to rearrange itself into a different picture, one where her son was still breathing. The air felt thick and heavy, difficult to inhale, charged with a silence so absolute that it seemed to press against the eardrums, drowning out the distant sounds of the street outside and creating a sealed vacuum of grief where nothing could grow but despair. Into this suffocating stillness, the second knock came, hesitant and almost apologetic, shattering the frozen tableau and sending a jolt of confused adrenaline through the parlor. It was not the heavy, authoritative rap of the official messenger who had come and gone, but the lighter, uneven tapping of the postman, a sound that belonged to a different lifetime, one that existed before the telegram arrived. The mother did not move, unable to process the intrusion of the mundane world into the sanctum of her mourning, but her daughter, eyes red and swollen, rose mechanically and walked to the door, her feet dragging on the carpet. When she returned, she held a stack of envelopes in her hand, the paper crisp and bright, bearing postmarks dated from the front lines only a few days prior. The irony was immediate and physical, a slap in the face of fate. Here, in the room where they had just accepted the finality of death, the postman had brought the voice of the deceased, written across the ocean weeks ago when he was still alive, still laughing, and still naive enough to believe he was coming home. The daughter placed the letters on the table next to the telegram, the two piles resting together in a cruel juxtaposition of bureaucracy and intimacy. The mother reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers tracing the familiar handwriting on the top envelope, recognizing the loops and slopes of the penmanship she had taught him as a child. With a deep, shuddering breath that sounded like a sob, she tore open the flap, the paper ripping loudly in the quiet room. As she pulled the pages out, a small photograph slipped out and fluttered to the floor, landing face up. It showed a young man in a uniform, his cap tipped back, smiling broadly at the camera with a cigarette dangling from his lips, his eyes bright with the invincibility of youth. The daughter picked it up, staring at the image of her brother, captured in a moment of joy that now felt like a betrayal. He looked so alive, so present, his smile frozen in a time that no longer existed, creating a dissonance that made the room spin. The mother unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the lines rapidly, desperate for one last touch of his soul, and began to read his cheerful account of a dry trench and a parcel of socks, her tears finally spilling over to blot the ink of a man who did not yet know he was already dead. The envelope arrived in a stack of mundane correspondence, mixed among bills and advertisements, utterly indistinguishable from the rest of the mail except for the distinctive military postmark in the corner. For the families who had already spent weeks navigating the gray, suffocating fog of grief, the sight of that handwriting was a jarring shock that threatened to overturn the fragile equilibrium they had established. The initial instinct was a flinch of pain, a retreat from the object that signaled yet another plunge into the abyss of loss, but that recoil was instantly arrested by the nature of the message contained within. This was not the hurried, desperate scrawl of a final testament written in a trench under shell fire, nor was it the stiff, formal condolences of a commanding officer. Instead, the paper was filled with a buoyant, almost reckless optimism, detailing a promotion that had been granted, a furlough that had been approved, or a sum of back pay that had finally been processed. The irony was a physical weight in the room. The soldier was writing to share the best news of his life, unaware that he was already a ghost, while the family at home was forced to celebrate a victory that belonged to a man who no longer existed. To read the words was to endure a surreal form of emotional whiplash, a sensation of falling while standing perfectly still. The writer spoke with excitement about a transfer to a safer base, or perhaps a medal he had been recommended for, detailing plans for a future that had been violently severed days before the ink had even dried. He described the warm meal he had just eaten or the comfort of a dry bed, simple pleasures that took on a horrifying poignancy when read through the lens of his subsequent death. The family found themselves in the agonizing position of trying to feel happiness for achievements that were now meaningless, torn between the instinct to honor his joy and the crushing reality that there would be no homecoming to celebrate them. It was a narrative of success that had arrived too late, a story of triumph that transformed instantly into a tragedy. The good news became a kind of taunt, highlighting the vitality and potential of the young man, all the things that the war had stolen, parading his hope in front of eyes that had already wept for his absence. This temporal distortion created a haunting disconnect in the quiet of the home. The letter demanded a reaction that the grieving family could not provide. It wanted cheers and laughter, it wanted relief and pride, but the atmosphere could only offer silence and tears. The promotion meant a higher wage that would go unspent, the furlough was a trip home that would never happen, and the medal was a piece of ribbon that would be posthumously pinned to a chest that would never feel the sun again. There was a cruelty in the specificity of the details, a mundane quality that made the impossible nature of the situation even more unbearable. He wrote about buying a gift for his mother with his extra pay, or visiting a specific pub he used to love, anchoring his joy in the real world which his family still inhabited but he had left. They were forced to walk through the landscape of his hopes, touching the map of his future plans, knowing that every step was on hollow ground. The letter was a conversation with a past that felt entirely too present, a cheerful voice echoing in a tomb. The absurdity of the situation often bordered on the macabre, a dark theater of the absurd played out on kitchen tables across the country. One could imagine the soldier checking his watch as he wrote, rushing to meet a mail convoy, his heart light with the relief of good fortune, entirely ignorant that his time had run out. The distance between his optimism and his fate was measured not in miles, but in the few days it took for the mail to travel, a gap that contained all the difference between life and death. The survivors were left holding the evidence of his final moments of happiness, artifacts of a time when he was alive and looking forward, which now served as the most painful reminders of his final moments. The cheerfulness in the script was not comforting, it was accusatory. It seemed to scream of the life that should have been lived, the decades that should have stretched out before him, filled with the small victories and good news that he would now never have. The letter was a promise that could not be kept, delivered by a hand that had been stilled. Ultimately, these letters forced the families to confront the sheer randomness of survival and death. The soldier had done everything right, he had excelled, he had been rewarded, and he had planned for a future that seemed secured by his good fortune. And yet, the postmark and the date of death told a story of chance that defied all logic and fairness. The good news highlighted the waste of it all, the potential that had been extinguished not because of failure, but despite success. It was easier to grieve a tragedy than to process a triumph that had been obliterated. The families had to mourn not just the man, but the version of the man who was happy and successful on his last day, a version of him that they would never get to know. The letter was a mirror reflecting a life that was vibrant and ascending, and looking into it only showed them the void where that life should have been standing. The irony was absolute. The dead brought the only comfort the living would receive, and it was a comfort that hurt more than the silence. The collision of these two timelines, the vibrant past captured in ink and the lifeless present standing in the doorway, did not create a bridge, it created an abyss. When the official notification arrived, often delivered by a somber clergyman or a uniformed officer whose presence announced the tragedy before he could speak, it did not merely inform the family of a death, it violently severed their anchor to reality. The document stating that a son had fallen on a specific date, perhaps weeks prior, felt impossible to reconcile with the letter held in the widow's hand. The mind rejected the data, stuttering and failing to sync the horror of the telegram with the casual, living warmth of the correspondence that had arrived simultaneously. The two artifacts occupied the same physical space but could not exist in the same logical universe, creating a cognitive dissonance that shattered the family's perception of time itself. In the immediate aftermath, the household was suspended in a surreal paralysis. The cheerful letter, which only moments before had been a source of comfort and laughter, transformed instantly into an object of uncanny horror. The jokes about the camp stew and the descriptions of the French sunshine now read like taunts, cruel ironies that mocked the grief sitting heavy in the room. The handwriting, once traced with loving fingers to feel close to the absent writer, now looked spectral, the script of a ghost who did not know he was dead. To read the words again was an act of torture, a journey into a past that had been erased by a shell burst miles away. The family realized they were weeping over a conversation that had long since ended, talking back to a voice that had been silenced before the envelope was even sealed. The temporal gap, which had previously been a source of anxiety, now hardened into an insurmountable wall of isolation. In the earliest hours of the morning, before the sun had fully crested the horizon to burn away the mist clinging to the hedgerows, the mail began its journey. It was a routine so deeply embedded in. This temporal distortion stripped the bereaved of the ability to mourn in a linear fashion. Grief requires an endpoint, a moment of loss from which one can begin to heal, but the delayed mail denied them this closure. They were forced to grieve forward, living through weeks of imaginary life that their deceased son had never experienced. In the days following the telegram, further letters might arrive, continuing the cheerful narrative of a man who was already buried. The family would receive updates on a health that had failed, news of a promotion that would never be taken, and plans for a leave that would never be granted. Each arrival was a fresh wound, a new resurrection of the dead that forced them to relive the death over and over again. The past continued to invade the present, an relentless tide of ghosts that refused to stay buried, keeping the trauma raw and the wound permanently open. The shock was not just in the loss of life, but in the loss of the truth. The realization that they had been living in a fiction, sustained by the well-meaning deception of the dead, was devastating. The safety they had felt during the weeks of silence was revealed to be an illusion, a trick of time and distance. They understood then the terrible cruelty of the postal system, which had preserved the boy's hope only to deliver it into a world where it had no place to exist. The chronological order of nature, birth, life, death, had been inverted. They were forced to bury the body while simultaneously receiving news of his spirit. The shock broke the clock, leaving them stranded in an eternal present where the dead never truly stopped speaking, and the living could never find the silence necessary to say goodbye. The paper felt rough against her fingertips, cheap and grainy, smelling faintly of the distinct, acrid tang of stale tobacco that had permeated the trenches where it was written. It was a tactile connection to a world that had already ceased to exist, a physical bridge spanning the impossible distance between the muddy, rat-infested fields of France and the quiet, sunlit parlor where she now sat. As she smoothed the creases with her palm, the irony of the moment settled over her like a heavy shroud. Here she was, holding a piece of him that was warm and alive, written in his own distinctive slanting hand, while the telegram on the nearby table, with its stark and clinical typography, told her that the hand which held the pen was now dust. The silence in the room amplified the sound of the rustling paper, a soft, dry noise that seemed deafening in the absence of his voice. She could almost visualize him hunched over a crate, using his knee as a desk, squinting in the fading light to get the words down before the dark made it impossible, unaware that he was writing his own ghost story for her to read. She began to read the words aloud, her voice trembling and catching on the syllables, forcing air through lungs that felt constricted by the crushing weight of the knowledge she possessed. "Dearest mother," it began, a simple, familiar greeting that suddenly felt like a sacred invocation, summoning his spirit into the room one last time. The text was mundane, filled with complaints about the endless rain that turned the bottom of the dugout into a soup of gray slime, and inquiries about the family dog whose name he misspelled in his haste. He wrote of a package of socks she had sent, declaring them the finest things he had ever owned, a treasure more valuable than gold in the freezing damp. He joked about the rations, describing the hardtack as being better suited for building foundations than for eating, his humor intact despite the gnawing hunger that must have been his constant companion. Reading these small, trivial details was an exquisite form of torture, a reminder of the ordinary human needs and frustrations that persisted even as the machinery of war ground on around him, reducing men to statistics. Yet, beneath the light-hearted banter and the desperate attempt to shield her from the horrors, there was a current of haunting foreshadowing that pierced her heart with a sharp, jagged pain. He mentioned that the artillery had been particularly loud the night before, a symphony of thunder that shook the ground beneath them, and he wrote that he was keeping his head down, a phrase that now felt like a tragic mockery given the finality of the telegram. He spoke of looking forward to the leave that was tentatively planned for the winter, describing how he wanted nothing more than to sit by the fire and listen to her play the piano, a fantasy so simple and domestic that it seemed to belong to a different life entirely. Every sentence was a stab of bittersweet nostalgia, a snapshot of a future that would never arrive, frozen in time on the page. She traced the ink where he had signed off, "Your loving son," the letters trailing off slightly as if he had been in a hurry to get the letter into the post bag before the morning mail cart left. It was his voice, undeniable and clear, echoing in the room, and the dissonance between that vibrant, living voice and the cold reality of his absence created a chasm of grief that seemed impossible to bridge. The physical act of holding a letter from a deceased loved one created a paradox of presence that defied the laws of nature and the finality of death. In the immediate aftermath of loss, the absence of a person is total, the house is quieter, the chair is empty, and the space they occupied feels like a vacuum that threatens to suck the air out of the room. Yet, when the letter arrived, suddenly that person was back, not as a memory or a spirit, but as a concrete force in the room. There was an undeniable intimacy in the paper itself, which the sender had touched, folded, and sealed with his own hands. For a few minutes, the barrier between the living and the dead seemed to dissolve. The handwriting was a unique map of his personality, the specific slope of the letters and the pressure of the pen serving as a fingerprint of his existence. Reading his words forced the bereaved to engage with him directly, to process his thoughts and respond to his tone, creating a one-sided conversation that felt agonizingly real. It was as if he had stepped through the door, sat down, and begun to speak, completely unaware that he was no longer welcome in the world of the living. This forced interaction often blurred the lines of reality, plunging the reader into a state of temporary denial. As the eyes moved across the lines, the mind constructed the voice that spoke them, the familiar cadence and inflection filling the silence of the room. It was impossible to read the letter without feeling the author's gaze, sensing the mood he was in when he wrote it, and feeling the emotions he tried to convey. If he wrote with humor, the family found themselves smiling against their will, caught in the trap of his personality even as the knowledge of his death loomed over them. This laughter was immediately followed by a crushing wave of guilt, a feeling of betrayal for finding joy in the words of a dead man. The letter acted as a time machine, transporting the household back to a moment when he was alive, a moment that existed independently of the tragedy. To engage with the letter was to suspend the truth, to live in a lie for the duration of the reading, creating a psychological dissonance that left the survivors exhausted and disoriented. The presence in the letter was so vivid that it made the absence in the room feel even more stark by comparison, like a phantom limb that ached more vividly than the limb itself. Furthermore, the mundane details contained in these missives often anchored the deceased too firmly in the world of the living, making his absence feel like a temporary misunderstanding rather than a permanent state. He wrote of fixing a fence, of a debt he owed a friend, or of a letter he was still waiting to receive from a sibling. These were the concerns of a man with a future, a man who expected to return to his life and pick up where he left off. By reading these plans, the family was forced to witness the construction of a future that had already been demolished. The presence in the letter was not just a memory of who he was, but a projection of who he thought he would become, a ghost with an agenda. There was a profound cruelty in the way the letter interrupted the process of letting go. Just as the family began to accept the silence, the letter forced them to listen to him again, to acknowledge his needs and his thoughts, which no longer had any place in the physical world. It was a relationship that refused to die, a voice that refused to be silenced, trapped in cellulose and ink, perpetually knocking on the door. The emotional toll of this interaction was compounded by the inability to answer. The letter demanded a response, the questions asked, the stories shared, and the affection expressed all cried out for a reply. But there was no one to write back to. The address on the envelope was a portal to a graveyard or a field of mud, a destination where no mail could ever reach him again. The bereaved were left holding their side of the conversation, words of love and explanation stuck in their throats, with no possible outlet. They could write back, of course, and many did, pouring their hearts out into letters that would be burned or buried, but the silence that followed was absolute. The presence in the letter was a one-way street, a haunting that offered no resolution. It forced the living to endure the pain of intimacy without the possibility of connection, to feel the warmth of a hand that was cold, and to hear the voice of someone who had already been claimed by the earth. The letter was a vessel for a soul that had nowhere else to go, lingering in the hands of those who loved him enough to keep reading. The earth in the military cemeteries abroad had a raw, unsettled quality, a stark contrast to the manicured grounds they would one day become. In the weeks immediately following the burial, the grave was awound in the landscape, the soil still dark and loose, heaped slightly above the ground level to account for the inevitable settling. A simple wooden marker, perhaps nothing more than a rough-hewn cross or a painted plank with a stenciled identification number, stood at the head of the rectangle. There was no grass yet, only churned mud that would cake into a hard crust under the sun or dissolve into a slurry during the rains. The grave was fresh enough that the scar of the excavation was still visible, the edges sharp and jagged, a testament to the hurried violence with which the hole had been dug and filled. It was a temporary bed for a permanent absence, a place where the physical reality of the loss was grounded in the smell of damp clay and upturned roots. Thousands of miles away, the families at home had no visual reference for this scene. They pictured the grave perhaps in a manicured garden behind a church, a familiar image of death drawn from civilian life. They could not conceive of the vast, sprawling fields of crosses that marched over the ridges of France, nor the utilitarian nature of these mass burials. In their minds, the sun rested in a place of peace, a quiet corner where birds sang and the sun warmed the stone. The reality was that he lay in a zone that was still technically operational, where the distant rumble of guns was a constant vibration in the soles of the feet. The grave was not yet a sanctuary, it was a depot, a holding place for the dead until the war ended and the ground could be properly organized. The silence around the freshly filled mound was not peaceful but empty, a vacuum created by the sheer volume of loss, where the individual identity of the soldier was subsumed by the geography of the conflict. The dissonance between the imagined grave and the actual one was profound. Back home, the mother might lay a place setting at the dinner table or keep his room exactly as he left it, rituals that preserved a sense of his presence. But in that distant field, his presence was reduced to a volume of displaced earth. The belongings that made him a person, his letters, his photographs, the lucky charm he carried in his pocket, were not with him in the ground. They were scattered, returned to the family or lost on the battlefield. The grave contained only the container, the exhausted shell that had ceased to function. It was a finality that felt incomplete. The physical act of burial had occurred, the body committed to the deep, but without the familiar markers of mourning, without the polished stone and the epitaph chosen by loving hands, the event felt provisional, as if the earth itself was hesitant to accept what it had been given. This unfinished state of the grave mirrored the unfinished state of the grief. The soil had not yet had time to reconcile itself with the coffin. There were no roots binding the dead to the land, no weathering to soften the edges of the wooden marker. It was a raw, exposed nerve ending of the war. For the families, the grave was an abstraction, a location on a map they could not point to without trembling. They had no way of knowing if the weather was beating down on the simple wood, if the rain was washing away the temporary inscription. The grave was recently filled, but the space it left behind in the house was a void that seemed to grow larger every day, a vacuum that no amount of incoming mail, no matter how cheerful, could ever hope to fill. The earth in the military cemeteries abroad had a raw, unsettled quality, a stark contrast to the manicured grounds they would one day become. In the weeks immediately following the burial, the grave was a wound in the landscape, the soil still dark and loose, heaped slightly above the ground level to account for the inevitable settling. A simple wooden marker, perhaps nothing more than a rough-hewn cross or a painted plank with a stenciled identification number, stood at the head of the rectangle. There was no grass yet, only churned mud that would cake into a hard crust under the sun or dissolve into a slurry during the rains. The grave was fresh enough that the scar of the excavation was still visible, the edges sharp and jagged, a testament to the hurried violence with which the hole had been dug and filled. It was a temporary bed for a permanent absence, a place where the physical reality of the loss was grounded in the smell of damp clay and upturned roots. Thousands of miles away, the families at home had no visual reference for this scene. They pictured the grave perhaps in a manicured garden behind a church, a familiar image of death drawn from civilian life. They could not conceive of the vast, sprawling fields of crosses that marched over the ridges of France, nor the utilitarian nature of these mass burials. In their minds, the sun rested in a place of peace, a quiet corner where birds sang and the sun warmed the stone. The reality was that he lay in a zone that was still technically operational, where the distant rumble of guns was a constant vibration in the soles of the feet. The grave was not yet a sanctuary, it was a depot, a holding place for the dead until the war ended and the ground could be properly organized. The silence around the freshly filled mound was not peaceful but empty, a vacuum created by the sheer volume of loss, where the individual identity of the soldier was subsumed by the geography of the conflict. The dissonance between the imagined grave and the actual one was profound. Back home, the mother might lay a place setting at the dinner table or keep his room exactly as he left it, rituals that preserved a sense of his presence. But in that distant field, his presence was reduced to a volume of displaced earth. The belongings that made him a person, his letters, his photographs, the lucky charm he carried in his pocket, were not with him in the ground. They were scattered, returned to the family or lost on the battlefield. The grave contained only the container, the exhausted shell that had ceased to function. It was a finality that felt incomplete. The physical act of burial had occurred, the body committed to the deep, but without the familiar markers of mourning, without the polished stone and the epitaph chosen by loving hands, the event felt provisional, as if the earth itself was hesitant to accept what it had been given. This unfinished state of the grave mirrored the unfinished state of the grief. The soil had not yet had time to reconcile itself with the coffin. There were no roots binding the dead to the land, no weathering to soften the edges of the wooden marker. It was a raw, exposed nerve ending of the war. For the families, the grave was an abstraction, a location on a map they could not point to without trembling. They had no way of knowing if the weather was beating down on the simple wood, if the rain was washing away the temporary inscription. The grave was recently filled, but the space it left behind in the house was a void that seemed to grow larger every day, a vacuum that no amount of incoming mail, no matter how cheerful, could ever hope to fill. On the kitchen table, the stark typewritten notification of death sat next to the handwritten envelope, creating a jarring juxtaposition of ink and paper that defied the logic of time. The telegram, delivered with terse military efficiency, cited a date of demise that was brutally specific, a moment when the life of the soldier had been extinguished under fire. Yet the postmark on the cheerful letter and the date written at the top of the page told a different story, one of survival and mundane routine. The calendar on the wall seemed to lose its meaning as the family stared at the two conflicting pieces of evidence. The son described the crisp morning air and a hot breakfast in a letter written 3 days after the date listed on the death certificate. To the parents holding these documents, the linear progression of days shattered. They were reading the thoughts of a ghost who, according to the official record, had already ceased to exist when he put pen to paper. This temporal anomaly created a cognitive fracture that prevented the acceptance of reality. If the letter was written after the date of death, then the death notice had to be wrong, a cruel clerical error in the chaos of war. The mind grasped for this error as a lifeline, refusing to believe that the military bureaucracy could be infallible while the handwritten words of their own child could be a lie. The parents found themselves living in a paradox where their son was simultaneously dead and alive, inhabiting a Schrodinger's box created by the slow movement of post across the ocean. They clung to the later date of the letter as the true timeline, using the evidence of his handwriting to override the cold finality of the telegram. It was a desperate act of denial, a rejection of the physical world in favor of the emotional reality presented in the letter. The calendar became a weapon, used to wound and to heal in the same breath. The horror of the mismatch was not just in the contradiction, but in the realization of what had occurred during that silent gap. As the family traced the timeline, they understood that the letter had been written in ignorance of its own redundancy. The soldier had sat on a crate in a muddy camp, perhaps looking forward to a hot meal or a rest, completely unaware that the army had already categorized him as a casualty. He had been planning a future that had already been closed off. The family was forced to witness this unknowing, to read his hopeful words with the terrible burden of foresight. They saw the innocence of his optimism and felt the crushing weight of the secret they now held, a secret that the writer himself would never learn. The letter was a message from a man who did not know he was dead, delivered to people who were struggling to learn how to live with that fact. As the days passed, the calendar on the wall continued to turn, marching forward into weeks and months that the soldier would never see. The mismatched dates became a permanent fixture in the household's history, a scar that never fully faded. The family learned to live in two timelines, the official one, marked by the anniversary of the death, and the personal one, marked by the dates on the letters which continued to arrive sporadically. Every new postmark that fell after the date of death was a fresh trauma, a resurrection of a voice that should have been silent. They marked time not by the passing of the seasons, but by these anachronisms, these ghosts that arrived in the morning mail. The synchronicity of life had been broken, leaving them stranded in a world where the past continued to arrive, long after the future had been cancelled. The mail cart rattled over the cobblestones, the ironclad wheels striking the stones with a rhythmic clatter that usually signaled the mundane arrival of bills and catalogs, but for the residents of this narrow street, it had become a daily harbinger of potential doom. Inside the small terraced house, the air was thick with the dust of neglect, the curtains drawn tight against the afternoon sun to keep the heat of the day from intruding upon the coldness that had settled in the parlor since the telegram had been delivered 3 days prior. The family sat in the dim light, trapped in a suspension of grief where time seemed to have ceased its forward march, leaving them in a loop of shock and denial that rendered the outside world irrelevant. They had already memorized the sparse, typewritten words of the War Office notification, the stark phrases, "killed in action," and "deeply regret" burned into their retinas, providing no comfort and no details, only a final, brutal full stop to a life that had just begun. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, each second a hammer blow against the silence, marking the passage of time that no longer held any meaning for them, a cruel reminder that the world kept turning even though their world had effectively stopped. When the postman finally pushed the letters through the brass slot in the door, the sharp sound of the paper fluttering to the doormat cut through the heavy atmosphere like a knife, causing everyone in the room to flinch. The son rose slowly, his movements stiff and jerky, as if his body were made of wood, and walked into the hallway to retrieve the pile. It was a mixed assortment of correspondence, electricity bills, a note from the grocer, and a single envelope with a field postmark that made his breath hitch in his throat. He recognized the handwriting instantly, the vigorous, slanted loops of the penmanship that belonged to his brother, a hand that had learned to form letters under the same roof where he now stood frozen. He carried the envelope back into the parlor, his hand trembling so violently that the paper rattled, and placed it on the table next to the offending telegram, the two pieces of mail lying side by side in a tableau of excruciating irony. The official notice was crisp and sterile, a document of death, while the envelope in his hand was crumpled and stained, bearing the fingerprints of a living man who had no idea he was already dead. He opened the letter with a sense of dread that made his stomach churn, the paper tearing with a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet room, and as he unfolded the pages, a photograph slipped out and landed face up on the table. It showed his brother smiling broadly, his cap pushed back on his head, sitting on a sandbag wall with a cigarette dangling from his lips, looking invincible and full of life. The image was a ghost from the past, a snapshot taken weeks before the shell that ended his existence had even been fired, capturing a moment of naive optimism that now seemed cruel in its vibrancy. He began to read the words aloud, his voice cracking under the strain of speaking for the dead, listening to his brother describe the beautiful weather they were having and the good rum they had been issued that morning. The letter was filled with plans for the future, jokes about what they would do when they got home, and a request for more socks because the damp was seeping into everything. Every cheerful sentence was a fresh wound, a painful reminder that the person writing this vibrant, hopeful prose was a corpse, rotting in a foreign field, and that the postal service had been slower than the artillery. The delay that had brought this letter to their doorstep was not a failure of logistics, but a torture device designed to extend their suffering, forcing them to hear the voice of the beloved just as they were trying to accept the silence of the grave. The two documents lay on the scratched surface of the table, occupying the same small space yet originating from universes that could not have been further apart. On the left, the War Office notification sat stiff and severe, its black border a stark frame for the few lines of typed text that had managed to dismantle an entire family structure with the efficiency of a machine gun. The language was cold, bureaucratic, and entirely devoid of humanity, designed to deliver a maximum of information with a minimum of emotion, using words like casualty and officially presumed, as if they were discussing a misplaced piece of equipment rather than a son. The paper was high quality, heavy, and crisp, smelling of the sterile ink in the administrative filing cabinets where it had been prepared by a clerk who had never met the boy and would forget the name the moment it was filed away. It was a document of finality, a full stop that offered no room for negotiation, no space for hope, and certainly no description of the moment life was extinguished. It simply stated that he was gone, reducing a complex, breathing human being to a statistic in a ledger of war, a necessary casualty in the grand scheme of the conflict. Beside this monolith of officialdom lay the letter, crumpled and creased, the paper thin and gritty to the touch, bearing the scars of its long journey from the front lines. It was chaotic and alive, filled with the cramped, hurried scrawl of a soldier writing by candlelight or in a brief moment of respite during a bombardment. Where the report was precise, the letter was messy, the ink blotted in places where his hand had slipped or the rain had dripped onto the page, turning the characters into dark, bloated flowers. This document was not a statement of death, but a testament to life, filled with the mundane, trivial details that the official dispatch had deliberately omitted. He wrote of the cold that seeped into his bones, the taste of the tinned bully beef that he had come to loathe, and the specific ache in his lower back from digging trenches through the hard chalk soil. He asked about the rose bush in the garden and whether the dog was still sleeping on the rug. He described the color of the sunset over the blasted landscape, beautiful, ghastly purple, that he wished she could see. It was a sensory explosion, a flood of sights, sounds, and discomforts that proved he had been warm, hungry, tired, and thinking of home right up until his final moment. The contrast between the two was not merely stylistic but ontological. One was a record of an event, while the other was the essence of a person. The telegram told them that he had ceased to exist, a biological fact that was irreversible and absolute. The letter, however, insisted that he had existed, vibrantly and urgently, screaming from the page that he was a man who missed his mother's cooking and laughed at his father's jokes. Reading them in sequence created a whiplash of cognitive dissonance that made the head spin and the stomach turn. The eyes would scan the typed words, killed, action, regret, and then slide over to the handwritten line, hoping to be home for Christmas, send more socks, and the brain failed to reconcile the two realities. It was a collision of the abstract and the intimate, where the machinery of the state, capable only of processing death, was rendered mute and absurd by the simple, undeniable humanity of a boy writing home. The report stripped him of his identity, but the letter gave it back in a way that was infinitely more painful, forcing the family to mourn not just the soldier who died, but the living, breathing, joking person who was trapped within the ink, frozen in a time that had already left them behind. He too was not merely stylistic but ontological. One was a record of an event, while the other was the essence of a person. The telegram told them that he had ceased to exist, a biological fact that was irreversible and absolute. The letter, however, insisted that he had existed, vibrantly and urgently, screaming from the page that he was a man who missed his mother's cooking and laughed at his father's jokes. Reading them in sequence created a whiplash of cognitive dissonance that made the head spin and the stomach turn. The eyes would scan the typed words, killed, action, regret, and then slide over to the handwritten line, hoping to be home for Christmas, send more socks, and the brain failed to reconcile the two realities. It was a collision of the abstract and the intimate, where the machinery of the state, capable only of processing death, was rendered mute and absurd by the simple, undeniable humanity of a boy writing home. The report stripped him of his identity, but the letter gave it back in a way that was infinitely more painful, forcing the family to mourn not just the soldier who died, but the living, breathing, joking person who was trapped within the ink, frozen in a time that had already left them behind. The arrival of the letter inevitably brings with it the desperate, clawing urge to respond, a biological imperative to answer a voice that calls out across the void. But as the pen hovers over the blank paper, the terrible reality sets in that there is no address on earth where this reply can reach its destination. The post box that once served as a portal to his world is now just a metal receptacle for garbage, a gateway to a void that swallows words without echo. This inability to answer creates a profound and agonizing regret, a sense of unfinished business that gnaws at the edges of grief. There are so many things that need to be said, explanations that need to be made, and reassurances that must be given, but the soldier has already moved beyond the reach of the mail service. The family is left holding a conversation that can never be completed, a dialogue severed in the middle of a sentence, with no hope of resolution. The silence that follows the reading of his words is not peaceful, it is a loud, oppressive absence where the response should be. This regret is often sharpened by the mundane questions the soldier asks in his letters, the trivial inquiries that suddenly take on the weight of Holy Writ. He asks if the dog is still behaving, if the roof was repaired before the winter rains, or if his sister received the parcel he sent. These are simple questions, but they are demands for information that the family is helpless to provide. They want to tell him that the dog waits by the door every evening, that the roof leaks despite the repairs, that his sister cried when she opened the box. They burn to bridge the gap between his curiosity and their reality, but the bridge has been burned. The knowledge that he died wondering about these small things, carrying a sense of separation that was never fully healed, is a heavy burden. The regret is not just for the big things left unsaid, but for the failure to soothe his anxieties about the life he left behind, a final maternal or paternal duty that has been stolen from them. There is also a bitter regret born of the things the letter does not say, the gaps in the narrative that the family will now never be able to fill. Perhaps he hinted at a worry but didn't elaborate, or mentioned a friend the family doesn't know by name. In a living relationship, these would be topics for the next letter, points to be clarified and expanded upon in an ongoing exchange. But with the finality of death, these loose ends become permanent knots. The survivors realize with horror that they will never know the full story, never get to ask, "What did you mean by that?" or "Tell me more about him." The letter is a static artifact, frozen in time, incapable of growth or elaboration. The regret stems from the realization that this is all there is, that the well of stories has run dry, and the opportunity to know him deeper has been abruptly terminated. They are left with a snapshot of his mind, frozen in a single moment, and no amount of longing can turn the image into a moving picture. Ultimately, The deepest regret is for the time that was wasted on trivialities when there was so much love left to give. Looking at his handwriting, the families often wish they could reach back through the weeks and pull him into a conversation that mattered more. They regret the distance, both physical and emotional, that the war imposed, and they curse the inefficiency of the mail that allowed his death to arrive before his news. The inability to answer the letter forces a confrontation with the absolute nature of loss. It is a wall that cannot be scaled, a door that cannot be opened. Every unmailed response serves as a tombstone for words that died before they could be born, a silent testament to a connection that was severed before it could reach its natural conclusion. The survivors are left stranded on the shore of memory, holding a letter that is essentially a message in a bottle thrown from a ship that has already sunk beneath the waves.